The year is 525. On a cliff overlooking the Red Sea, a man sits on horseback. Behind him lie the ruins of a kingdom that has just collapsed. Ahead of him, hundreds of sails belong to an army that has crossed the sea to end his reign. There is no line left to hold, no army left to command, no crown left worth keeping. Arabic historical tradition, written centuries later, tells us that, rather than surrender, this king chose to ride his horse straight into the waves. We don't know if this actually happened. No contemporary source describes his death. But the story survived for over 1,000 years because it captured something true about how his world ended. His name, in the inscriptions he left behind, was Yusuf As'ar Yath'ar. Later generations would remember him by another name, Dhū Nuwās, the last king of Himyar. But to understand why a king might choose death over surrender, and why an entire kingdom that once dominated most of South Arabia collapsed the way it did, we need to go back more than 600 years, and to a time when the name Himyar meant almost nothing at all. Just a minor tribe living in the shadow of a far more legendary kingdom, Saba. You may not know these names yet, but they built cities the way Rome did, fought over trade the way the great merchant powers of later history would, and vanished the way few great powers ever fully do. This is that story. Because the story of Himyar is not only the story of a forgotten kingdom. It is the story of how trade, religion, and imperial ambition collided at the edge of the ancient world. When we picture the ancient Arabian Peninsula, most of us imagine sand, camels, and scattered oases. But the far south of the peninsula, modern-day Yemen, was a strikingly different world. The Romans called it Arabia Felix, Fortunate Arabia. This is a highland region that receives seasonal rainfall rare elsewhere on the peninsula, conditions that made large-scale agriculture possible in a landscape most people assume was uniformly arid. Communities here built terraced fields climbing up mountainsides, along with an extensive network of dams, channels, and reservoirs to capture and store every drop of rain. This irrigation system, not spices alone, was the real foundation that allowed South Arabian kingdoms to sustain large cities in rugged, mountainous terrain. From roughly the 8th century BCE to the 6th century CE, this region was shaped by a series of competing and allied kingdoms, all vying for control of the lucrative incense trade: Saba, Qataban, Hadramaut, and later Himyar. Of these, Saba is the name most people would recognize. This is the kingdom tied to the legend of the Queen of Sheba, Bilqis, in Arabic tradition, said to have visited King Solomon. For centuries, Saba was practically synonymous with the wealth and power of South Arabia. But kingdoms that become immortal in legend aren't necessarily immortal on the battlefield. And from the mountains south of Saba, a new power was quietly rising. Its name was Himyar. Saba's power rested on a single, extraordinary piece of engineering: the Great Dam of Marib. This dam irrigated tens of thousands of hectares of farmland and made Marib one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world. the beating heart of the incense trade routes running north toward the Mediterranean. But by the last centuries BCE, that heart was already weakening. Trade routes were shifting, partly toward maritime shipping across the Red Sea, partly toward new inland players competing for the same caravans. Saba's grip on those routes loosened. Its wealth, once concentrated at Marib, began to disperse. Into that vacuum stepped a highland tribe, with no legendary queen and no ancient dam of its own. Only ambition, and a capital of its own choosing, Zafar. This wasn't a single battle that ended an empire. It was a slow transfer of gravity, from one city to another, from one royal house to another. That took generations to complete. Before Himyar became a kingdom, it was the name of a tribe and ruling clan based in the region of Dhū Nuwās, in the southwestern highlands, initially under the orbit of the kingdom of Qataban. Like many ancient Arabian polities, it would eventually take its name directly from the tribe that founded it, a pattern common across the region, where a ruling lineage's name became, over time, the name of the land itself. Toward the end of the 2nd century BCE, Himyar emerged as an independent power in its own right, ruling from the city of Zafar on the highlands of southwestern Yemen. Not long after, Himyarite kings began adopting a new royal title, King of Saba and Dhū Nuwās, a public declaration that Himyar was no longer standing in Saba's shadow, but actively competing for supremacy over South Arabia. This was not a single lightning conquest. It unfolded gradually, over centuries. Himyar first brought Saba under its control around 25 BCE. But it wasn't until the late 3rd century CE that Himyarite dominance became total. The kingdom of Qataban was absorbed around 200 CE, and by roughly 300 CE, Hadramaut, the last major independent kingdom in South Arabia, had also fallen. Picture a map where each color represents a different kingdom: Saba, Qataban, Hadramaut, Ma'in, gradually disappearing one by one, until the entire south of the peninsula is a single color: Himyar's. The figure who marks this turning point is Shammar Yuharaish, ruling in the late 3rd century. His royal title reflects the new scale of his power precisely: King of Saba, Dhū Nuwās, and Hadramaut, and Yamnat. Himyar was no longer a mountain tribe. It had become the dominant power across South Arabia. Notably, under Shammar's reign, Himyar sent a diplomatic mission thousands of kilometers away to Ctesiphon, the seat of the Sasanian Persian Empire. This tells us that by this point, Himyar was no longer an isolated regional kingdom, but had entered the diplomatic arena of the wider Near East. But military conquest is only half the store. To understand how wealthy and sophisticated Himyar had become, we need to step inside the very city where its kings ruled: Zafar. Zafar sits at roughly 2,800 meters above sea level, about 130 kilometers south of modern Sana'a. Archaeologists from the University of Heidelberg, who have been excavating the site since 1998, and have mapped a walled ancient city with a fortified core covering roughly a square kilometer, a substantial scale for a highland city of this period. At its height, archaeologists estimate Zafar was a sizable urban center, likely home to tens of thousands of people, though, as with most ancient population estimates, exact figures remain uncertain. From here, Himyarite kings, later remembered in Arabic tradition as the Tubba, ruled, building palaces, temples, and a central fortress known as Husn Raidan. But kingdoms are not built by kings alone. Behind every inscription and palace stood thousands of people whose names history never recorded. Farmers worked the terraced slopes above Zafar, coaxing wheat, barley, and vines from mountainsides most outsiders would have written off as unfarmable. Engineers and laborers maintained the dams and channels that made that farming possible at all. It's a job that never really ended. Because a single flash flood could undo years of work in an afternoon. Merchants moved in caravans along routes that stitched Zafar to the Hijaz in the north and to the ports of the Red Sea coast in the south, carrying not just incense, but textiles, metalwork, and news. Down at those ports, sailors and dock workers loaded ships bound for India and East Africa, part of a maritime network that connected Himyar to a world far larger than Arabia itself. Craftsmen carved the reliefs and statues that filled Zafar's temples and palaces. Ibex figures, human busts, alabaster panels, work skilled enough that examples of it still survive in museums today. Evidence suggests that different religious communities, Jewish, Christian, and followers of the older polytheistic cults, existed within the same political world, under the same kings, a coexistence that was often uneasy, and that would later erupt into the very conflicts this story is built around. The stones tell us much about kings. They tell us far less about the women who lived beside them, the wives, mothers, and daughters of Zafar, whose names rarely made it into royal inscriptions at all. None of these people appear by name in a single royal inscription. But without them, there is no Zafar, no dam, no army, no king. If there was a single moment to picture Himyar at its peak, it would be here. In the 4th and early 5th centuries, Zafar was at its fullest, markets loud with goods from 3 continents, temples and palaces rising on the hillside, workshops turning out reliefs and inscriptions by the hundreds. The Tubba kings sent envoys as far as Persia and received them from across the Red Sea. Caravans linked the Indian Ocean trade to the Mediterranean world through Himyarite territory. And for the first time in South Arabia's history, nearly the entire south of the peninsula stood under a single crown. This was not a distant, sleepy kingdom on the edge of the map. For a few generations, Himyar was one of the powers the wider world had to take seriously. Mentioned in the same breath as Persia and Aksum, courted rather than ignored. It's worth holding on to that image, because it's what makes the ending, still generations away. Land as hard as it does. The answer isn't simply, they sold incense. Yemen sat at a near-perfect geographic crossroads, linking the Indian Ocean, East Africa, the Arabian interior, and the Mediterranean world. From this position, Himyar controlled the flow of frankincense, myrrh, spices, and goods arriving from India, alongside inland caravan routes connecting oases and cities across South Arabia. Himyar's wealth wasn't only visible from the inside. Centuries earlier, Greek and Roman writers had already taken notice of this corner of Arabia. The anonymous 1st century CE Greek merchant's guide, known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes ports and trade goods along this same coastline, and the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote about the aromatics. Trade flowing out of South Arabia toward the Mediterranean. Neither source describes Himyar by that name specifically. They predate Himyar's rise to dominance. But they confirm something important. This coastline, and the wealth moving through it, was already on the radar of the classical world long before Himyar's kings began styling themselves
as rulers of all South Arabia.
This wealth wasn't only about trade.
Archaeological surveys around Zafar have documented a dense network of water management structures, dams, channels, reservoirs, pointing to a society capable of mobilizing significant labor and sustaining intensive highland agriculture. This was the material foundation that actually fed an empire-scale kingdom. Trade also left behind something you can hold: coins. Himyar minted its own currency, and like many ancient states on the trade frontier, its early coinage borrowed visual language from the Mediterranean world, echoing Athenian and Roman-style imagery before developing more distinctly local styles and legends over time. Some of these coins have been found well outside Yemen's borders, physical proof of how far Himyarite trade networks actually reached. The site museum at Zafar today holds roughly 220 inscriptions and close to 900 reliefs.
From the Himyarite period, dating from the 3rd to the early 6th century CE, an evidence of a culture with wide-reaching artistic and cultural connections across the Red Sea world and the Mediterranean. But the strangest thing about Himyar isn't found within Zafar's walls. It's carved into stone, in Musnad script, the ancient writing system of South Arabia. Musnad is not the Arabic script we'd recognize today. It's older, more angular, related instead to the broader family of ancient South Arabian alphabets, carved rather than written, meant to last in stone rather than flow across paper. Thousands of these inscriptions survive across Yemen. Royal announcements of military victories, records of temple construction, land grants, legal codes, and, as we'll see, declarations of faith. Because starting sometime around the 4th century, something unusual begins happening in these inscriptions. The old gods start to disappear. Before the 4th century, South Arabian religion followed a fairly typical polytheistic pattern. Individual city, states, and tribes often had their own patron deities, and temples served as both religious and political centers. Nothing unusual by ancient world standards. What's unusual is what happens next. Beginning around the 4th century, the royal and public inscriptions in Himyar show a marked shift. The old polytheistic names fade out, replaced again and again by a single title, Rahmanan, the Merciful, along with recurring formulas like Lord of Heaven and Earth, and, in some inscriptions, even Lord of Israel. This is one of the most significant religious shifts in pre-Islamic Arabia. By the late 4th century, the ruling elite of Himyar appear to have adopted a form of monotheism heavily shaped by Judaism. The exact degree to which this reflects formal conversion to normative Judaism, as opposed to a broader Judaizing monotheism, remains a genuinely open question among historians.
What's less contested is the political logic behind it. In a newly unified, multi-ethnic kingdom, monotheism may have functioned as a unifying force and a distinct identity. One that also positioned Himyar apart from both Christian Byzantium and Aksum on one side, and Zoroastrian Persia on the other. Against this backdrop, a king from the early 5th century, Abu Karib As'ad, enters the story. Here it's worth clearly separating two layers of the narrative.
At the historical layer,
inscriptions from his reign confirm a period of deepening monotheistic and Judaizing influence at the Himyarite court. At the layer of tradition, meaning stories told centuries later by Islamic-era historians, not something archaeology directly confirms, Abu Karib is described as having marched north into the Hijaz, reaching Yathrib, later Medina, meeting with Jewish scholars there, and even being linked, in some accounts, to the tradition of draping the Kaaba in Mecca with cloth. It's important to say plainly, this is what later Arabic historical tradition tells us, not something contemporary archaeology confirms directly. But even as legend, these stories point to something real.
by this point,
Himyar's ties to the Jewish world of the Hijaz were significant enough to still be remembered centuries later. Whether every detail is historical or not, the memory of Himyar had already crossed beyond Yemen's mountains, reaching into the sacred geography of Arabia itself. Abu Karib was not an isolated figure. He was one link in a long chain of kings later Arabic tradition would remember collectively. As the Tuba, a title that itself became a symbol of far-reaching royal power. Between Shammar Yuhara'esh's unification of the south and Abu Karib's reign, generations of these kings expanded and defended what had been built.
launching campaigns north toward the edges of the Hijaz,
deepening trade and diplomatic ties with the tribes and towns along those routes, and steadily reinforcing Zafar's status as the political and religious center of gravity for the entire peninsula, Al's southern half. And among the last rulers to inherit this strange religious transformation was a king whose name would become forever tied to the destruction of Himyar itself, Yusuf As'ar Yath'ar. By the time he took the throne in 522, known to Arabic tradition as Dhū Nuwās, he wasn't stepping into an empty seat. He was the last in a line of kings that had already run for centuries. Inheriting both the reach and the rivalries that line had built, whether he was ready for either or not. But the religious choices of Himyar's kings wouldn't just reshape Yemen. They would pull the entire kingdom into the middle of a confrontation between the greatest powers of the ancient world. By the early 6th century, three major powers had their eyes on South Arabia: the Byzantine Empire to the northwest, the Kingdom of Aksum across the Red Sea, and Sasanian Persia to the east. In the middle sat Himyar. The reason was practical. Yemen controlled access to the Bab al-Mandab Strait, the gateway between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Whoever controlled Yemen, or at least had a friendly power there, controlled a critical artery of trade linking Europe, Africa, and Asia. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian I viewed Yemen not as some remote backwater, but as a strategic piece on the board of his broader rivalry with Sasanian Persia, a rivalry that stretched from the Caucasus to the Red Sea. Byzantine interest in Himyar's affairs and its support for Aksum's ambitions there cannot be separated from this larger imperial contest. It's important not to flatten this into a simple story of Jews versus Christians. What was really unfolding was a tangle of religion, trade, international alliances, and rival factions within the Himyarite court itself. Aksum, the Christian kingdom based in what is now Eritrea and Ethiopia, had long-standing, direct ties to the Arabian coast, confirmed by both royal Aksumite inscriptions and Ge'ez and Greek language sources. Byzantium as the region's dominant Christian power saw Aksum as a natural partner for extending its influence into Yemen, partly for religious reasons, and partly to keep Sasanian Persia from gaining a foothold in South Arabia. Against this backdrop, Christian communities in Arabia continued to grow, particularly in the oasis city of Najran in northern Yemen. Meanwhile, Himyar's central authority entered a period of instability. An earlier Aksumite punitive expedition around 518 had already installed a Christian Himyarite king, Ma'dikarib Ya'fur. Then, in 522, everything changed. A man with several names seized the throne in a coup. In the inscriptions, Yusuf As'ar Yath'ar. In later Arabic tradition, Dhū Nuwās. Yusuf As'ar Yath'ar isn't a purely legendary figure. His name appears directly in contemporary South Arabian inscriptions, placing him in a rare position, a figure confirmed by archaeological evidence and, at the same time, with the central character of centuries of later legend. Like many members of the Himyarite elite before him, he followed a Judaizing monotheistic tradition, and he seized the throne in 522 through a coup, overthrowing the previous, Aksum-aligned king.
As soon as he took power,
Yusuf launched a military campaign to eliminate remaining Aksumite forces and influence within Himyarite territory. Sources describe him attacking and killing Ethiopian communities at the port of Mocha and in Zafar itself, his own capital. About a year later, his campaign turned toward Najran, one of the most important Christian centers in northern Arabia. In 523, Yusuf's forces besieged and took the city. According to contemporary Christian sources, most notably a letter written by Simeon of Beth Arsham, thousands of people, including clergy, women, and children, were executed after refusing to renounce their faith. The leader of Najran's Christian community, Harith ibn Ka'b, later venerated as Saint Arethas in both Catholic and Orthodox tradition, was executed along with hundreds of his followers. It's worth noting how this event is documented. Inscriptions from Himyar's own military campaign around Najran and the nearby site of Himyar, dated to 524 to 525, still survive today, confirming a Himyarite military presence in the region during this exact period. This isn't a story told from only one side of the sources. It left traces in the historical record from both directions. News of the massacre at Najran spread quickly across the Christian world, from Byzantium to Ethiopia.
This was no longer a local affair in a distant corner of the Arabian Peninsula. It became a perfect justification, moral and strategic at once, for Aksum to intervene militarily. Once and for all. Aksum's king at the time, Caleb, also known as Ella Asbeha, had both a religious motive, protecting persecuted Christians, and a strategic one, restoring Aksumite influence in Yemen, which Yusuf's coup had swept away. Sources suggest Caleb was actively encouraged toward this invasion by Byzantine officials, including the Patriarch of Alexandria.
Around 525, a large Aksumite fleet crossed the Red Sea, landing forces on the Yemeni coast. The campaign was swift and decisive. Yusuf's army, despite having been strong enough to conquer Najran, could not withstand a large-scale invasion backed by both naval power and international diplomatic support.
Himyar fell. Dhū Nuwās' reign came to an end. A kingdom that had taken more than 600 years to build could collapse in a single military campaign.
No contemporary source tells us exactly how Dhū Nuwās died. What modern historians can say, cautiously, is that he appears to have died during or shortly after Aksum's conquest in 525. But that gap in the historical record was later filled by Arabic tradition, with a far more symbolic ending. Rather than surrender, rather than hand his crown to the victors, the king is said to have ridden his horse straight into the Red Sea. King and horse vanished beneath the waves. Whether history or legend, this image became a symbol for the end of an entire era.
But the death of a king doesn't mean the death of a civilization.
After 525, Aksum controlled Yemen through a series of client kings. Within less than a decade, one of those client arrangements produced an unexpected turn. An Aksumite general stationed in Yemen, Abraha,
broke away from Aksumite authority and made himself an independent ruler of Himyar's former territory,
holding power there for several decades. Among those who inherited the ruins of Himyar, Abraha's name would go on to echo the furthest. Not through South Arabian inscriptions alone, but through Islamic tradition, where he's remembered in connection with a church he built in Sana'a, and with a story that would later be told in the Quran itself, the Year of the Elephant. That's a story for another episode. What matters here is this: Himyar's fall didn't end Yemen's history, it just handed the next chapter to someone else. Later still, Sasanian Persian influence spread into South Arabia, and within a few more decades,
the entire Arabian Peninsula would enter an entirely new chapter of history, the Age of Islam.
That's a different story. What matters here is what Himyar left behind.
Archaeologists from the University of Heidelberg, working continuously at Zafar since 1998,
have recovered thousands of fragments of architecture, reliefs, and inscriptions,
including monotheistic texts referencing the Lord of Israel, physical evidence of the religious revolution that shaped this kingdom for over a century. So why do so few people today know the name Himyar? Part of the answer is structural. Unlike Rome, Himyar left no surviving empire to carry its name forward into later centuries. No line of successor states that kept calling themselves Himyarite. Part of it is linguistic. The Sabaic language,
and the Musnad script that had recorded Himyar's history. For centuries were gradually displaced by Arabic, and within a few generations after the rise of Islam, almost no one could still read the stones their own ancestors had carved. And part of it is simply geography. Himyar's story unfolded at the edge of the classical world's attention, remembered in fragments by Byzantine and Ethiopian writers, rather than at its center. Not every civilization disappears because it was destroyed. Some disappear because no one was left to keep telling their story.
What Himyar left behind isn't an empire that still bears its name. It's evidence, buried, then rediscovered.
Of a pre-Islamic Arabia far more complex and sophisticated than the popular image of desert.
And nomadic tribes, a kingdom with advanced irrigation engineering, diplomatic ties to major empires, sweeping religious transformations.
And kings whose names have survived, carved in stone over 1,500 years. More than 1,000 years have passed since the last kings of Himyar disappeared. There is no army of the Tubba'a left, no court at Zafar. The caravan routes have long since gone silent. But on the mountains of Yemen and on the stones of Arabia, their names are still there, carved in a script whose writers likely never imagined that, more than 1,500 years later, we would still be trying to read their story. The people are gone. The stones still speak. If you had to pick one figure for the next episode, Abu Karib As'ad, Dhū Nuwās, or Abraha, carved in a script whose writers likely never imagined that, more than 1,500 years later,